I recently had an economist and philosopher come and do some stuff here, and she basically wrote the book on why Nordic countries are the happiest countries in the world on the, lists every year that they do on happiness indexes for countries. So, for instance, the Forbes happiest countries in the world list, like Finland wins, what, 6 years in a row? And it's like, why does that keep happening? And why does the United States keep falling further and further down? Because we don't learn from the countries that are doing well. Why are they doing well? You might say, oh, well, a lot of their laws are citizen focused. True, but where did that come from? You might say, oh, well, their economies are doing pretty, decent, and, the wealth gap might be large, but the quality of life for the poor people is not that far off from the quality of life for the rich people. There's just people in the world who live that way. That's cool, but where does that come from? You might say, oh, well, it's because, their food is guaranteed, their housing is guaranteed, their, lifestyle has no risk to it for basic human needs because it's all guaranteed. Their health is universal. Their healthcare is universal. Their education is not only free, but in a lot of the countries, actually, like, they get paid to go to college and higher education. That's where it comes from, right? Sort of. The reason all of those things exist is because back in the day, the countries were actually really poor, and they were like, hey, all these countries around us, they're powerful, we're poor, we gotta do something. And it became an understood concept that the more ignorance amongst the poorest of people, the more likely there would be revolt against changes done in the country. And so it became very important to educate even the most destitute person, so that when changes happened in the country, they would understand why that was happening, and they would understand why it required sacrifice from the average citizen, what the average citizen was getting back out of it, and there wouldn't be revolutions, there wouldn't be revolts, there wouldn't be riots, there wouldn't be all this kind of problems that they were just actively trying to avoid the expense and the problem of. And so they started making little folk schools and things like that and educating people. That sense of let's educate everyone, even the poorest people, let's avoid ignorance, it still is like translated to this day. In the Nordic countries, the highest profession you can have is not to be a movie star or a politician, it's to be a teacher. Teachers are honored there, and students, they have an incredible education system because they care so much about the students. They intentionally try to look for what makes that person happiest and feel most passionate, and then they dive into that with them, and they give them opportunities to fully explore that for like months at a time. The play is very encouraged for the young kids. Getting active is encouraged for young kids. They're invited to learn instead of a demand to learn. And so education is still huge to them to this day. So no wonder they want higher education. No wonder they insist on certain pay thresholds for degrees, because they actually care about education. But they do it in a little bit different way. You could say the same thing about Singapore. Singapore also cares about education. They do a thing called streaming, where as soon as the kid's a little kid, like even a tiny child, they start having tests for them, trying to figure out where their skills and their intelligence levels are, and put them based on that, and not on the wealth of their families they come from, but on their intelligence levels and their talent levels into programs and into schools. And the older they get, the more tests they take, the more things they get shoved into that are directly related to where their talents lie or where their intelligence lies. And it's their system of getting people into the workforce, ready to work, ready to do the thing that they could most contribute to society by doing, while being very capable at it. The big difference between streaming and education in the Nordic countries, though, is In the streaming system in Singapore, it's still about getting a worker. And in the Nordic countries, it's about building a whole person. There's a thing in, I believe, Finland, it's called sisu, and it is translated basically to perseverance with contentment, or being content while persevering. It's this sense of, yeah, the winter's gonna be cold. Yeah, someone's gonna get sick. Yeah, stuff's gonna happen. But I have space and time for myself. I am going to take care of myself and my loved ones, and that's not going to change. There's this sense of, I'll get through it. We'll get through it. And we'll be okay. To this day, in the Nordic countries, there's a pretty strong sense of trust with like government and stuff, with corporations and stuff, sometimes a little too much trust, but they have this overall sense of, I understand why this policy is changing, because they still believe that the biggest way to avoid conflict amongst citizens is for them to all be educated, for them to all understand what's happening and why it's happening. There's a very real reason why the Nordic countries tend to be the happiest countries in the world. They get to avoid a lot of the baseline things that are hard for human beings to deal with, because they're educated enough to know that they don't want to be bogged down by those things. It's a tremendous thing. So many countries don't emulate it. We have decades of them proving how it works and showing and exemplifying. Still, it doesn't get implemented in other countries because a lot of countries depend on the desperation of a large portion of the populace in order to function. That desperation creates the opportunities for economic growth that they're looking for. And so they don't really care about how high the risk of revolt or revolution is, because they'll just squash it when it happens, because the people are so desperate they can't really accomplish much when they do that. So they protest. Oh well, we'll just squish them down. They haven't got much clout. They have almost no authority. We'll just squish them anyway. Unfortunately, there's way too many countries who feel that way. There's also a decent amount of countries that like the streaming system, and they like the idea of getting talented, skilled workers who go straight to work. And so there's a workforce treadmill that gets made. It's not like every country is saying, oh yeah, I want my citizens to be super happy and to understand things and highly educated. And it's not like the Nordic countries are perfect. I mean, unfortunately, a decent chunk of them are pretty racist. But you can take the good and leave the bad when learning from systems and from people. When you look at people who are suffering, when you look at people who are just so destitute and struggling, can barely survive, they're homeless or they're starving, they're unable to pursue their health because the medical bills would be way too much. Sometimes you feel hopeless. And I hope that it adds a little sense of hope that somewhere in the world, right this very second, there are people who just don't live that way. That the possibility for that exists. And it's not a perfect system, but still, if it could happen there, there's a possibility it could happen elsewhere, in other countries that are suffering.